A single gunshot shattered the serene Montana morning, sending a flock of startled crows into the sky as Sadie O'Connor raced through the forest, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. The year was 1876, and the remote wilderness outside of Coloma, Montana territory, cared little for a woman's troubles or her truth. Behind her, voices called out her name not in concern but in anger. She ran faster, clutching the leather satchel to her chest, containing the only proof of her innocence and the corruption that plagued her hometown. Sadie's boots slipped on the morning dew-covered grass as she descended toward the river, her cornflower blue dress now torn at the hem and smudged with dirt. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, wild tendrils whipping across her face as she glanced over her shoulder. 22 years of life hadn't prepared her for becoming the most wanted woman in Madison County. "There she is," a man's voice bellowed. "Don't let her reach the river." Panic surged through her veins as she spotted 3 riders cresting the hill behind her. The sheriff's posse men who once tipped their hats to her on Sunday mornings now hunted her like a criminal. She pushed her burning legs harder, knowing the shallow crossing ahead was her only chance to reach the neighboring county where perhaps someone might listen. The thunder of hooves grew closer. Sadie reached the riverbank and plunged in without hesitation, gasping as the frigid water soaked her skirts. The weight instantly dragged at her, turning each step into a struggle. Midway across, the current strengthened, pulling at her waist as she fought to keep the precious documents dry above her head. A rifle shot cracked, sending water spraying inches from her face. Sadie stumbled, losing her footing on the slippery river stones. The current caught her, sweeping her downstream as she struggled to keep her head above water. The satchel slipped from her grasp and she lunged desperately, fingers just managing to snag one of the straps. The river rounded a bend, carrying her away from her pursuers, but the victory was short-lived as she realized the roaring sound ahead could only mean one thing: rapids. Sadie clawed frantically at passing branches, but the current was too strong. As the first white-capped wave struck her, sending her under momentarily, she thought this might be how her story ended, not with justice, but with the cold embrace of mountain waters. As she surfaced, choking and sputtering, she heard a different sound cutting through the roar of water, a man's voice, commanding and strong. Grab the rope. Through water-blurred vision, she saw a lasso slicing through the air toward her. With her last reserves of strength, Sadie reached out, fingers closing around the rough hemp. The rope went taut, nearly pulling her arms from their sockets as she was dragged steadily toward the shore. Powerful hands grabbed her shoulders, hauling her onto the rocky riverbank. Sadie collapsed, coughing up water, still clutching the sodden satchel. When she finally looked up, she found herself staring into the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson. "You're a fair piece from town to be taking a morning swim, madam," the stranger drawled, a hint of amusement in his deep voice despite the concern etched on his features. "They're coming," Sadie gasped, struggling to her feet. "The sheriff, they think she swayed, lightheaded from exhaustion. The man steadied her with a firm grip. "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, hoofbeats pounded along the riverbank. The stranger's expression hardened as he took in her frightened state and the approaching riders. "Behind me," he said simply, positioning himself between Sadie and the approaching danger. Sheriff Pullman and his deputies reined in their horses 20 yards away, their expressions darkening when they spotted the man standing protectively before their quarry. "Irons," the sheriff acknowledged with a curt nod. "Didn't expect to find you involved in this mess." "Wasn't planning on it," the man Irons replied evenly. "Found this lady nearly drowning. Mind telling me why you're chasing her with rifles instead of throwing her a rope?" The sheriff spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "That lady is wanted for theft and murder. She's coming back to Coloma to face justice." "Murder?" Sadie cried, stepping forward despite Irons' attempt to keep her behind him. "That's a lie." "I didn't kill anyone. Edward Harvey killed himself after I discovered what he and you have been doing." "See, hysterical and dangerous," the sheriff said, gesturing to his deputies to move forward. Stand aside, Irons. This doesn't concern you. The stranger Irons didn't budge. Instead, he studied Sadie with those penetrating blue eyes before returning his attention to the sheriff. Seems I'm already concerned, he stated. You boys look mighty eager to get your hands on a soaking wet woman half your size. Makes a man wonder what she knows that's got you so riled. Xavier Irons, the sheriff growled, you're interfering with official business. I won't ask again. Then don't, Xavier replied, his hand casually resting near the revolver at his hip. But I reckon if this lady did what you're claiming, you'd have brought proper papers. All I see is 3 men with itchy trigger fingers. The standoff stretched, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Finally, the sheriff jerked his chin at his deputies. This isn't over. We'll be back with papers and more men. He fixed his gaze on Sadie. Nowhere to run, Miss O'Connor. You'll hang for what you've done. As they rode away, Sadie's knees finally gave out. Xavier caught her before she hit the ground, his strong arms surprisingly gentle. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. They wouldn't have taken me back alive. I believe you, he said simply, helping her to a fallen log. Now, suppose you tell me what has the law in Coloma hunting you down like a wounded deer. Sadie clutched the satchel tighter, weighing her options. This man, Xavier Irons, had just placed himself between her and danger without knowing her story. Such men were rare, especially in territories where survival often meant minding one's own business. My name is Sadie O'Connor, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. 3 days ago, I discovered ledgers proving the sheriff, the bank manager, and several town council members have been stealing from the mining company payroll and framing innocent miners. When I confronted Edward Harvey, my employer, and the bank manager, he shot himself rather than face exposure. Now they're claiming I murdered him and stole from the bank. Xavier listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once. And those papers in your satchel? He asked, gesturing to her white-knuckled grip on the leather bag. Proof. Ledgers, letters, transfer notes, everything showing what they've done and who they've wronged. Sadie's chin lifted defiantly. I worked as Harvey's assistant for 3 years. I know every transaction, every falsified record. So you're running to what the territorial marshal? The circuit judge in Helena, she replied. Judge Barnett has a reputation for honesty if I can reach him. Xavier stood, adjusting his hat. Helena's 100 miles north. You won't make it alone with the sheriff sending telegrams ahead and passes behind. Defeat washed over her. I have to try. Nobody in Coloma believes me. They think I was Harvey's mistress, that I killed him in a lover's quarrel. Her voice cracked. My own father wouldn't even listen. Xavier studied her for a long moment. They don't believe me, she said, her voice barely audible over the rushing river. The cowboy's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then I'll speak loud enough for both of us, he replied with quiet determination. Sadie stared at him, hardly daring to hope. You'll help me? Why, you don't know me. Know enough, Xavier said, offering his hand to help her stand. No innocent folks shouldn't hang for crimes they didn't commit, and I know Pullman's been sheriff too long with too few questions asked. His lips quirked in a half-smile that transformed his rugged features. Besides, my ma raised me never to leave a lady in distress. I can't ask you to risk your life. You didn't ask, I offered, he interrupted, leading her toward a stand of pines where a magnificent chestnut gelding was tethered. First thing is getting you somewhere safe and dry before night falls. My cabin's half a day's ride from here. We'll sort the rest tomorrow. Xavier helped her mount before swinging up behind her, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. As they rode away from the river, Sadie felt something she hadn't experienced since discovering Harvey's betrayal hope. Mr. Irons, she ventured after they'd ridden in silence for several miles. Xavier, he corrected. Xavier, she repeated, testing the unusual name. I want you to know, if this goes badly, I won't let you take the fall with me. His chest rumbled against her back in what might have been a chuckle. Let's worry about getting you to that judge before planning who takes what fall. He paused, then added more softly, and Miss O'Connor, I've been taking my own falls since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Don't trouble yourself on my account. They rode on as the sun climbed higher, the rhythmic movement of the horse and the warmth of Xavier's presence eventually lulling Sadie into an exhausted doze. She woke with a start when the horse stopped, momentarily disoriented until Xavier's voice grounded her. "Home, sweet home," he said, nodding toward a well-built log cabin nestled against a rocky hillside. "Not fancy, but it's solid and the chimney doesn't smoke." It was a modest dwelling, but far more substantial than the crude shelters most bachelor prospectors or cowboys cobbled together. A small corral stood to one side with two other horses grazing peacefully, while a clear spring bubbled from the hillside nearby. Everything spoke of care and permanence, not the temporary camp of a drifter. Xavier helped her dismount, her muscles protesting after the long ride. When her sodden shoes touched the ground, she winced, only now becoming fully aware of her bedraggled state. "Let me tend to Brigadier here, then we'll get you fixed up," Xavier said, already leading the horse toward a lean-to stable. Sadie waited awkwardly, suddenly conscious of her situation alone, miles from anywhere, with a man she'd known less than a day. Yet something about Xavier Irons inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he'd faced down the sheriff without bluster or bravado, or how he handled his horse with quiet competence, or simply the fact that he hadn't pressed her for details beyond what she'd volunteered. The cabin's interior surprised her when Xavier finally ushered her inside. Though undeniably masculine and spare, it was clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking area nearby. A stout table with two chairs sat beneath a window, while a curtained alcove presumably hid the sleeping area. Bookshelves held an impressive collection, not just dime novels, but leather-bound volumes of history, law, and literature. "You read Thoreau?" Sadie couldn't help asking, spotting a familiar spine. Xavier glanced up from where he was kneeling to light the fire. "Man makes good points about self-reliance," he replied, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "You know his work." "I've always loved books," she admitted. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married. She taught me to read when I was 4. The fire caught, sending warm light dancing across the room. Xavier straightened, dusting his hands. "There's a trunk in the back with some of my sister's things. She visits sometimes." "Should be something dry you can change into while your clothes dry." Sadie hesitated. "Your sister won't mind?" "Rebecca would have my hide if I let a lady shiver in wet clothes on account of propriety." He gestured toward the curtained alcove. "Help yourself, I'll fix something to eat." Behind the curtain, Sadie found a small but comfortable sleeping area and the mentioned trunk. Inside were several simple dresses and undergarments. She selected the plainest, a serviceable brown calico that was only slightly too large in the shoulders. After changing and attempting to restore order to her hair with a wooden comb she found, she emerged feeling somewhat more human. Xavier had his back to her, tending to something sizzling in a cast iron pan that filled the cabin with a mouth-watering aroma. He'd removed his hat and coat, revealing broad shoulders and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Smells wonderful," Sadie said. He turned, and something flickered in his eyes as he took in her transformed appearance. "Better than wet," he commented, gesturing for her to sit at the table. "Just bacon and beans, I'm afraid, not much for fancy cooking. After today, anything warm would be a feast." They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes before Xavier spoke. "You should rest. Tomorrow we need to make plans." "Plans, I thought," Sadie began, then stopped. Of course, reaching Helena wouldn't be as simple as riding straight there, not with the sheriff hunting her. "Pullman will have riders watching the main trails," Xavier confirmed, reading her thoughts. "And the telegraph will be carrying news of a dangerous murderess to every settlement between here and the capital." Sadie set down her fork, appetite suddenly gone. "So I'm trapped, not trapped, just need to be clever." He studied her across the table. "Tell me everything you know about the sheriff's operation. Every name, every detail." For the next hour, Sadie laid out the entire scheme she'd uncovered, how Sheriff Pullman, Edward Harvey, and Councilman Wilson had been skimming from the mining payroll for 2 years, falsifying ledger entries and blaming discrepancies on supposedly thieving miners. 17 men had been arrested, some sent to territorial prison. 3 had been shot while escaping. I started noticing inconsistencies in the ledgers 6 months ago, she explained. Small things at first, numbers that didn't quite match, deposits recorded differently in different books. When I asked Mr. Harvey about them, he always had explanations that seemed reasonable enough. Xavier listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of financial matters. The last straw was Jamie Sullivan, Sadie continued, her voice hardening. He was just 19, supporting his widowed mother. They accused him of stealing $50 from the payroll. When he protested his innocence, the sheriff beat him so badly he lost sight in one eye. They sent him to prison for 5 years. And that's when you started looking closer, Xavier surmised. Sadie nodded. I began staying late, comparing records after everyone left. 3 days ago, I found a hidden ledger in Harvey's desk, the real accounts showing everything, when I confronted him. She swallowed hard. He laughed, said no one would believe a woman over respected businessmen. Then he offered me a choice: join their operation or face consequences. So you took the ledger. I took everything I could find, letters between them, the false records, everything. Her fingers twisted in her lap. I was going to leave town the next morning, but Harvey must have realized what I'd done. He came to my boarding house that night, drunk and threatening. He had a gun. We struggled. It went off. Xavier's expression remained steady, non-judgmental. Self-defense. It wasn't even that, Sadie said, the painful memory fresh despite her exhaustion. He shot himself. The gun was pointed at him when it discharged, but by morning the sheriff was claiming I'd murdered Harvey for spurning my advances and stolen bank funds to flee with. My own father, her voice broke. Your father sided with them, Xavier finished quietly. He's the town barber. Depends on their good opinion for his business. Sadie couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. He always taught me to tell the truth, but when it mattered most. Xavier reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers briefly. Truth's a luxury for those with power to protect it, he said, a shadow crossing his face. For everyone else, it's a risk. The simple touch and the understanding in his words nearly undid her. After days of terror and betrayal, being believed felt like the most precious gift. You should sleep, Xavier said, standing and clearing their plates. Take the bed, I'll use my bedroll by the fire. I couldn't, you can and will, he cut her off firmly. You've been shot at, half drowned, and ridden hard all day. The bed's yours. Too exhausted to argue further, Sadie retreated behind the curtain. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the sheets clean and smelling faintly of pine. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard Xavier moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire for the night. Xavier, she called softly, the movements paused. Yes, thank you, not just for helping, but for believing me. There was a moment of silence before he responded. Get some rest, Sadie. Dawn comes early in these mountains. In the soft darkness, Sadie allowed herself to acknowledge how strange it was that, in the midst of the worst trouble of her life, she had found perhaps the one person she could trust completely, a stranger whose life she had upended without warning. As sleep claimed her, she wondered what kind of man Xavier Irons really was, and why fate had placed him by that river at exactly the right moment. Dawn broke clear and cold, sunlight filtering through the cabin's small windows. Sadie woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dry if somewhat worse for wear, and emerged to find Xavier already up and cooking. Morning, he greeted, sliding a plate of flapjacks onto the table. Hope you're hungry. Starving, actually, she admitted, surprised by her appetite. You're up early. Habit, he replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Been thinking about your situation. Sadie sat, accepting the offered cup gratefully. And direct route to Helena's out, Xavier said, joining her at the table. Too many eyes watching, but I might know another way, longer but safer. He outlined his plan as they ate. Instead of heading north to Helena directly, they would travel east to a small settlement called Prosperity, where Xavier knew the telegraph operator. From there, they could send a secure message to Judge Barnett requesting a discreet meeting place. Meanwhile, they would circle around through backcountry trails few knew existed, approaching Helena from the east rather than the south. "Will take us near 2 weeks instead of 1, Xavier concluded, but less chance of running into Pullman's men. 2 weeks, Sadie repeated, considering. They could do a lot of damage in that time, covering their tracks. They could, Xavier agreed, but they also might get sloppy, thinking you're no immediate threat, might even create more evidence against themselves trying to hide what they've done. Sadie studied him over her coffee cup. You seem to know a lot about how lawmen think and financial records and backcountry trails. A ghost of a smile touched Xavier's lips. Been around. Were you an outlaw? She asked bluntly. That actually drew a laugh from him, a rich, unexpected sound that transformed his serious face. No, madam, quite the opposite, in fact. Then what, a banker? You don't strike me as the type. Xavier hesitated, then sighed. Worked for Pinkertons for 7 years, detective specializing in bank fraud and embezzlement cases. Sadie's eyes widened. A Pinkerton detective? Here. But why not anymore? He interrupted firmly. Left the agency 3 years ago, wanted simpler things. He gestured around the cabin. This is who I am now, just a man with a small ranch and no boss but himself, understanding dawned. That's why you believed me. You've seen similar schemes before, similar enough, he acknowledged, and you don't strike me as the murdering type. High praise, Sadie said with a wry smile. Xavier's expression sobered. We should leave within the hour, pack only what's essential. I have nothing to pack except the evidence, Sadie reminded him. Everything I owned was in my boarding house. Rebecca has a saddlebag you can use, Xavier said, rising, and you'll need sturdier clothes for where we're going. He disappeared briefly into a storage area, returning with canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, and a worn leather jacket. These might fit well enough with some adjustments. Sadie eyed the men's clothing with momentary hesitation. Her mother would have fainted at the impropriety, but practical concerns quickly overrode convention. Thank you, they'll be much better for riding than this dress. While Xavier prepared the horses, Sadie changed into the offered garments. The trousers were too long and had to be rolled up, the shirt engulfed her, and she had to cinch the belt to its smallest hole, but the result was surprisingly comfortable. She braided her hair tightly and tucked it under a borrowed hat, completing the transformation. Xavier did a double take when she emerged from the cabin. You'll pass for a boy at a distance, he said with approval. Might just save your life if we run into trouble. And what's our story if someone asks? Sadie inquired, checking that the precious ledgers were secure in the saddlebag. You're my younger brother Samuel, helping me move cattle to new grazing land, Xavier replied, adjusting the saddle on a sturdy paint mare. Simple stories are best easier to remember, less details to slip up on. Within the hour, they were riding eastward, the morning sun at their backs. Xavier led them through dense forests and narrow ravines, avoiding the main trails. He rode with the easy confidence of a man intimately familiar with the land, occasionally pointing out landmarks or plants of interest. By midday, they had covered significant ground. They paused to rest the horses beside a clear mountain stream, sharing a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits. Were you always good with numbers? Xavier asked unexpectedly, breaking their companionable silence. Before working at the bank, I mean, Sadie nodded, surprised by his interest. Always. My teacher said I had a mathematical mind, wanted me to pursue more education, but she shrugged. My father thought bookkeeping was respectable enough for a woman. Anything more would be putting on airs. Shame, Xavier commented. World needs sharp minds regardless of who they belong to. What about you? Sadie asked, curious about her enigmatic companion. How does a cowboy become a Pinkerton detective specializing in financial crimes? A shadow crossed his face. Wasn't always a cowboy. My father was a banker in St. Louis, expected me to follow in his footsteps, sent me to the best schools, apprenticed me in his bank when I was 18. His jaw tightened. Then I discovered he'd been embezzling from his clients for years, ruined dozens of families. What did you do? Sadie asked softly. Turned him in, Xavier said flatly. Testified against my own father. He died in prison 2 years later. I'm sorry, Sadie murmured, understanding better the man before her. That must have been terrible. It was, but not as terrible as what he did to those people who trusted him. Xavier's eyes met hers. After the trial, a Pinkerton agent approached me, said I had an eye for financial irregularities and a strong moral compass. Offered me a job, and you took it, for 7 years, traveled all over the country investigating similar cases. He ran a hand through his dark hair. Got tired of seeing the same crimes, same greed over and over, wanted something simpler, more honest, so you bought land in Montana Territory, Sadie concluded. Seemed as good a place as any to start over. Xavier stood, signaling the end of the conversation. We should keep moving. Want to reach Wilson's Creek by nightfall. They rode for the remainder of the day, the terrain growing increasingly challenging as they moved into less traveled country. Xavier maintained a vigilant watch, occasionally stopping to study their back trail or listen intently to distant sounds. As promised, they reached Wilson's Creek just as dusk was settling. Xavier led them to a secluded spot upstream from the main crossing, where a small clearing nestled against a rocky overhang provided natural shelter. We'll camp here, he decided, dismounting. Fire's a risk, but night gets cold up here and the rocks will help hide the light. Sadie slid from her horse, wincing as her unaccustomed muscles protested the long day's ride. I can gather firewood, she offered, determined to pull her weight. Stay within sight of camp, Xavier cautioned, already unsaddling the horses. And listen for my whistle if there's trouble. As Sadie collected fallen branches, she marveled at how quickly her life had transformed. Just days ago, she'd been a respectable bookkeeper with a predictable future. Now she was a fugitive in men's clothing, camping in the wilderness with a former detective. Strangely, despite the danger, she felt more alive than she had in years. When she returned with an armload of wood, she found Xavier had already laid out bedrolls and was setting up a small circle of stones for the fire. You're good at this, she observed, depositing her contribution. Had practice, he replied, efficiently arranging kindling. Spent more nights under stars than under roofs during my Pinkerton days. The fire caught quickly, and soon they were sitting side by side, warming themselves as night settled fully around them. Xavier produced a small pot and some dried ingredients, creating a simple but satisfying stew. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the forest. We should reach Prosperity by tomorrow afternoon, Xavier said finally, setting aside his empty plate. Town's small, just a trading post, saloon, and a few buildings, but Joseph Miller runs the Telegraph and he owes me a favor. What kind of favor? Sadie asked, curious. Xavier's expression softened slightly. Cleared his son of rustling charges a few years back. Boy was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the local ranchers wanted blood. I found the real culprits. You've helped a lot of people, Sadie observed. Some, he acknowledged. Not enough. Is that why you're helping me, to balance some cosmic ledger? Xavier looked at her directly, the firelight casting shadows across his strong features. I'm helping because it's right. Same reason you took those ledgers instead of looking the other way. Sadie held his gaze, struck by the simple truth in his words. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or merely the bond that forms between people who face danger together. Whatever it was, it warmed her more thoroughly than the fire. We should sleep, Xavier said, breaking the moment. I'll take first watch, wake you in a few hours. I've never kept watch before, Sadie admitted. What should I look for? Patiently, Xavier explained what signs of danger to be alert for unusual sounds, silences where there should be noise, the behaviors of wildlife that might indicate human presence. His teaching was clear and respectful, assuming her intelligence without question. As Sadie settled into her bedroll, she found herself studying Xavier's profile as he sat alert beside the fire. For a man so skilled in violence, she'd seen the ease with which he handled his weapons. He possessed a gentleness that surprised her. Not weakness, but the confident restraint of someone who had nothing to prove. Xavier, she said softly. He turned, eyebrow raised in question. Thank you, not just for helping me, but for treating me like I'm capable. Something in his expression softened. You are capable, Sadie O'Connor. Wouldn't have survived what you have otherwise. With that simple affirmation warming her heart, Sadie drifted into sleep, feeling safer than she had any right to under the circumstances. Morning came with a light drizzle that dampened spirits and gear alike. They broke camp efficiently and rode eastward, the mountains gradually giving way to rolling hills. By midday, the rain had stopped, and Xavier pointed to a thin plume of smoke rising from beyond the next ridge. Prosperity, he confirmed. Remember, you're Samuel, my younger brother. Speak as little as possible, Sadie nodded, tucking stray hairs more securely under her hat. How will we know if it's safe? We won't, entirely, Xavier admitted. But Miller's telegraph office has a back entrance. If there's trouble, we'll know before committing ourselves. Prosperity proved to be even smaller than Xavier had described, barely more than a cluster of weathered buildings huddled around a dusty main street. A few horses were hitched outside the saloon, and an ancient dog dozed on the porch of the general store. Nothing about the scene suggested danger, yet Xavier approached cautiously, circling around to approach from the north rather than the west. Miller's office is the small building next to the trading post, he murmured as they rode slowly down the street. Keep your head down and let me do the talking. Sadie hunched her shoulders, trying to mimic the posture of a young man. She kept her eyes lowered as instructed, but couldn't help noticing the curious glances from the few people visible on the street. Strangers were obviously uncommon in Prosperity. They dismounted outside a narrow clapboard building with a faded sign reading Telegraph and Post. Xavier tied the horses and gestured for Sadie to follow him inside. The office was empty save for a balding man with spectacles, who looked up from his desk with a start when the bell above the door jangled. Recognition dawned immediately in his eyes. Xavier Irons, he exclaimed, rising to his feet. Been a dog's age since you passed through. Hello, Joseph, Xavier greeted, closing the door firmly behind them. Need a private word if you've got a minute. Miller's eyes darted to Sadie, curious. Course, who's your friend? Later, Xavier said meaningfully. Is there anyone in town I should know about? The telegraph operator's expression grew serious. Matter of fact, yes, had riders through yesterday asking after a woman, young, brown hair, blue dress, said she's wanted for murder down in Coloma. Sadie's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face carefully neutral. That's so. Xavier asked casually, they still around? Miller shook his head. Left yesterday, heading east, but they left descriptions with everyone in town, offering $100 to anyone who spots her. He studied Sadie more carefully. Funny thing is, they said she might be traveling with a tall fella with dark hair. Xavier's posture remained relaxed, but Sadie noticed his hand had moved slightly closer to his holstered revolver. Interesting. Any official papers with these descriptions? None that I saw, Miller replied. Just their word, said they were deputies, but he hesitated. Didn't much look like lawmen to me, more like hired guns. Appreciate the information, Joseph, Xavier said. Now, about that private word somewhere your equipment can't be seen from the street. Understanding dawned in Miller's eyes. He led them through a door into a back room cluttered with supplies and telegraph equipment. Once the door was closed, Xavier made quick introductions. Joseph, this is Miss Sadie O'Connor. She's the woman they're looking for, but the charges are false. She's uncovered corruption in Coloma that goes straight to the sheriff's office. Miller whistled low. Always thought there was something off about Pullman, too slick by half. He nodded respectfully to Sadie. Madam, convincing disguise. Thank you for seeing us, Sadie said, relieved to drop the pretense. We need to send a secure message to Judge Barnett in Helena. Barnett's a good man, Miller agreed, but sending anything with his name on it would raise flags. Every operator between here and Helena would notice. We need a code then, Xavier decided. Something that would seem like ordinary business to anyone reading it. For the next hour, they crafted a carefully worded message that appeared to be about a cattle sale, but actually requested a meeting with the judge at a remote location. Miller assured them he could send it through personal channels, bypassing the regular telegraph network where possible. It'll take time to get a response, he warned. 2 days, maybe 3. We can't stay here that long, Xavier said, glancing at Sadie. Too risky, Miller thought for a moment. My sister has a small cabin about 15 miles northeast of here, up in the foothills. She's visiting family in Bozeman until spring. You could hole up there and I'll ride out when I get a reply. That's too much risk for you, Sadie protested. The telegrapher smiled kindly. Miss, if Xavier says you're in the right, that's good enough for me. Besides, my boy would have hung for something he didn't do if not for him. I owe him more than a ride and a telegram. With the plan set, Miller provided them with directions to the cabin and offered supplies from his personal stores. He also confirmed that the nearest territorial marshal was currently in Bannack, at least 3 days' hard ride away, too far to be of immediate help. Keep to the high ground, Miller advised as they prepared to leave. Game trails are less traveled but faster if you know where they lead. And Miss O'Connor, he added with unexpected gentleness, keep faith. Justice moves slow, but it usually finds its way eventually. They left Prosperity from the same direction they had entered, then circled around to approach the foothills from a less obvious route. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed, with pine forests replacing the open grasslands below. Miller's a good man, Xavier commented after they had ridden in silence for several miles. One of the few I trust completely. You seem to inspire loyalty, Sadie observed, the way he spoke about you helping his son. Xavier shrugged uncomfortably, just did what was right. That's rarer than you think, Sadie said softly, thinking of how quickly her neighbors and even her own father had turned against her. Most people do what's easy or what benefits them personally. Including me most days, Xavier admitted. But some things you can't turn away from without losing pieces of yourself. He glanced at her. Think that's why you took those ledgers, to keep those pieces intact. The question caught Sadie by surprise not because of its content, but because it revealed how accurately Xavier had understood her motivations. Yes, she answered simply. I couldn't live with myself if I'd stayed silent. They reached the cabin as dusk was settling, finding it exactly where Miller had described, a small but solid structure nestled in a grove of aspens. It was more rustic than Xavier's home, but clean and well-maintained, with basic furnishings and a sturdy wood stove. Not bad, Xavier commented, surveying the single room with an approving eye. Miller's sister keeps a tidy place. Sadie moved to the small window, looking out at the deepening shadows among the trees. Do you think we were followed? Don't think so, Xavier replied, but I'll take precautions just the same. While Sadie organized their meager supplies, Xavier set trip wires around the perimeter and positioned their horses in a natural enclosure where they would be hidden from casual observation, but able to graze. By the time he returned, Sadie had a fire going in the stove and water heating for coffee. Looks like we might be here a few days, she said, setting out the tin cups Miller had provided. I hope Judge Barnett responds quickly. If he's the man I remember, he will, Xavier assured her. He has little patience for corrupt officials. The evening settled around them with surprising domesticity as they shared a simple meal and discussed what might happen when they finally reached the judge. Xavier believed that with the evidence Sadie had gathered, Barnett would likely issue warrants immediately. The difficulty will be executing those warrants, he explained, cleaning his revolver by the light of a single lantern. Pullman controls Coloma completely. Even with official papers, any lawman would face resistance. So all of this might be for nothing, Sadie said, the weight of doubt pressing down on her again. Xavier looked up, his blue eyes intent. Not nothing. Truth has value in itself even when justice is slow to follow. Spoken like someone who's seen justice delayed, Sadie observed, or denied entirely, Xavier agreed with a grim smile. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. As the night deepened around them, Sadie found herself studying Xavier more carefully. There were layers to him she hadn't yet penetrated, a sense of old pain carefully contained, principles tested but unbroken, and something else she couldn't quite name that drew her to him despite the circumstances. Tell me something, she said impulsively. Something true about Xavier Irons that has nothing to do with Pinkertons or outlaws or justice. Surprise flickered across his features before a slow smile emerged. That's a tall order, Miss O'Connor. We might die trying to reach this judge, Sadie pointed out reasonably. Seems only fair I should know something of the man I'm risking my life alongside. Xavier considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. He set aside his weapon and leaned back in his chair. I write poetry, terrible poetry, mind you wouldn't inflict it on anyone with functioning ears. But I write it just the same, usually at dawn when the mountains look like they're on fire. Of all the things Sadie might have expected, this wasn't among them. Her delighted laugh seemed to startle them both. Poetry, really? A hint of color touched Xavier's tan cheeks. Told you it was terrible. I think it's wonderful, Sadie said honestly. Would you share some? Not if wild horses were dragging me backward through a cactus patch, he replied firmly, though his eyes crinkled with amusement. Your turn, something true about Sadie O'Connor, Sadie considered. I can't whistle, she admitted. Not even a little. My father tried to teach me when I was a girl, but I just blow air. He finally gave up, said some people just aren't meant to whistle. That's it. Your deep, dark secret is a whistling deficiency. Xavier asked, his rare, full smile transforming his face. It's embarrassing, Sadie protested, laughing. Every time someone whistles for a dog or to get attention, I'm reminded of my failure. Could teach you, Xavier offered casually. Not much else to do while we wait for Miller. And so, in the most unlikely of circumstances, Sadie found herself receiving whistling lessons from a former Pinkerton detective in a borrowed cabin while fugitives from a corrupt sheriff. Xavier proved a patient teacher, demonstrating different techniques and encouraging her attempts without mockery. By the time exhaustion claimed them both, Sadie had managed to produce something approaching a whistle, though it was breathy and uncertain. Progress, Xavier declared, stifling a yawn. You'll be calling hounds by the time we reach Helena. They established a watch schedule as they had on the trail, with Xavier taking first shift. When it came time for Sadie's turn, she found herself reluctant to wake him. He looked younger in sleep, the lines of vigilance smoothed from his face. But duty was duty, and she gently touched his shoulder. Xavier woke instantly, fully alert, his hand moving to his gun before recognition dawned. Your watch, he asked, voice rough with sleep. Yes, Sadie confirmed. All quiet so far, he nodded, sitting up and running a hand through his disheveled hair. Wake me if you hear anything unusual, anything at all. I will, she promised. As Xavier settled back into his bedroll, Sadie took up position by the window, rifle across her lap. The night was clear, stars brilliant above the dark silhouettes of pine trees. In the silence, she found her thoughts returning to Xavier, his unexpected poetry, his unwavering principles, the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face. She was developing feelings for him. The realization should have alarmed her, given their precarious situation, but somehow it felt as natural as breathing. Whether anything would come of it seemed almost beside the point. The simple fact of its existence was a kind of miracle in itself, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the heart continues its ancient work. The next 2 days passed in a strange limbo of waiting and preparation. Xavier insisted they use the time to plan multiple routes to Helena, memorizing landmarks and identifying potential dangers. He also continued Sadie's education in practical matters: how to move silently through forest, how to read weather signs, how to handle the rifle with greater confidence. For her part, Sadie shared her knowledge of banking operations, helping Xavier understand the full implications of the evidence they carried. Together, they organized the ledgers and documents into a clear narrative that even a non-specialist could follow, ready for presentation to the judge. On the afternoon of the third day, as Sadie was practicing her still imperfect whistling while preparing a stew from their dwindling supplies, Xavier suddenly raised his hand for silence. He moved to the window, every line of his body alert. Rider coming, he said quietly. Single horse moving slow, Sadie set aside the wooden spoon and reached for her rifle. Might be Miller, Xavier cautioned, though he too had drawn his revolver. Stay inside, out of sight. He slipped out the door, positioning himself behind a large pine where he could observe without being seen. Sadie watched through the window as a solitary horseman appeared among the trees, following the faint trail toward the cabin. Relief washed through her as she recognized Joseph Miller's distinctive bowler hat. She opened the door just as Xavier stepped from cover to greet the telegrapher. "Got a response," Miller called as he dismounted stiffly, "and news you'll want to hear." Inside the cabin, Miller gratefully accepted coffee while delivering his information. Judge Barnett had replied promptly to their coded message, agreeing to meet them at an abandoned mining camp called Eagle's Rest, 40 miles north of their current position. "That's not all," Miller continued, his expression grave. "Word came down the wire that there was a shooting in Coloma, Town Councilman Wilson's dead, supposedly shot by a drifter in a dispute over a card game." Xavier and Sadie exchanged significant looks. "Convenient timing," Xavier commented. "Wilson was one of the men named in your evidence." "Pullman's tying up loose ends," Sadie said grimly. "Making sure Wilson can't testify against him," Miller nodded. "Gets worse. The drifter was shot while resisting arrest, no witnesses except the sheriff's men." The implications were clear. Pullman was eliminating co-conspirators and potential evidence simultaneously. "We need to reach Barnett as soon as possible," Xavier decided. "When's the meeting?" 3 days from now," Miller replied, "but there's another complication." The message mentioned increased patrols on all roads leading north from Madison County. Seems Pullman's called in favors with neighboring sheriffs. "Can we trust this judge completely?" Sadie asked, suddenly worried about walking into a trap. "Barnett's solid," Xavier assured her. "Known him for years. He's been fighting corruption in the territory since before Montana had a name." They spent another hour discussing routes and contingencies before Miller departed, promising to maintain the fiction that Sadie and Xavier had continued eastward if anyone came asking. 3 days to reach Eagle's Rest," Xavier said once they were alone again. "Terrain's rough, but doable if we push hard." "And if we encounter these patrols?" Sadie asked. Xavier's expression hardened. "We avoid them if possible, if not." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. They departed before dawn the next morning, traveling light and fast. Xavier led them along game trails and old trapper paths, avoiding the established routes. The terrain grew increasingly challenging: steep ridges, dense forests, and swift-running streams that had to be forded carefully. By midday, they had covered nearly 15 miles, but the horses were tiring. They stopped in a sheltered hollow to rest and eat a cold meal, not risking a fire despite the chill in the air. "We're making good time," Xavier said, studying a crude map he'd sketched based on his knowledge of the region. "Should reach Beaver Creek by nightfall." "There's a spot there where we can camp safely." Sadie nodded, massaging her sore legs discreetly. The past days of riding had toughened her considerably, but the pace Xavier set was demanding even for experienced riders. "You're holding up well," he observed, not missing her discomfort despite her attempt to hide it. "Most city folk would have collapsed by now." "I'm motivated," Sadie replied with a wry smile. "Amazing what the threat of hanging can do for one's endurance." Xavier's expression softened slightly. "When this is over, what will you do?" The question caught Sadie by surprise. She had been so focused on survival and justice that she hadn't thought beyond reaching Judge Barnett. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back to Coloma even if Pullman is arrested. Too many people there believed the worst of me too easily." "You could start fresh somewhere," Xavier suggested. "Denver, maybe, or San Francisco. Your skills would be valuable in either place." "Perhaps," Sadie said, though the idea of such distant cities held little appeal. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind. "What about you? After we reach the judge, will you go back to your cabin?" Xavier looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. That was the plan. And now? He turned back to her, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "Now I'm not so sure." Before Sadie could respond, he stood abruptly. "We should move, still have a lot of ground to cover before dark." They continued northward, the conversation lingering unfinished between them. As Xavier had predicted, the terrain grew more difficult as they proceeded, requiring them to dismount and lead the horses through particularly treacherous stretches. Late in the afternoon, as they were navigating a narrow path along a steep slope, Xavier suddenly raised his hand in warning. He pointed silently to the valley below, where 4 riders were visible following the main trail. "Pullman's men," Sadie whispered. Xavier nodded grimly. "Recognized Stevens, one of his deputies." They remained motionless until the riders passed out of sight, then continued with even greater caution. By dusk, they reached Beaver Creek, a substantial stream flowing through a wooded valley. Xavier led them to a secluded spot where a fallen tree and overhanging rocks created a natural shelter. "We'll camp here," he decided, helping Sadie dismount. "No fire tonight." They settled in for a cold, uncomfortable night, sharing dried beef and hard biscuits. As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped sharply, bringing a reminder that summer was waning in the high country. "Here," Xavier said, noticing Sadie's shivering despite her efforts to hide it. He removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Can't have you freezing before we reach Barnet." "What about you?" she protested. "Run hot," he replied with a shrug. "Always have." The coat carried his warmth and scent, wrapping around Sadie like an embrace. She pulled it closer, grateful for both the physical comfort and the gesture behind it. "Xavier," she began hesitantly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." He looked at her expectantly, his face half in shadow. "When this is over, would you consider?" Sadie faltered, suddenly unsure how to express what she wanted to say. Xavier waited, unusually patient. "I mean, if I were to stay in Montana territory instead of going to Denver or San Francisco." She took a deep breath. "Would there be a reason for me to do that?" Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something softer. "Sadie," he said quietly, "there would be every reason." The simple statement, delivered without embellishment or flowery sentiment, was perfectly Xavier, direct, honest, and more meaningful for its plainness. "Oh," Sadie breathed, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with his borrowed coat. "Good." Their eyes held in the darkness, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Xavier reached out slowly, his calloused hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather-light but sent warmth cascading through her. "Should get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Long day tomorrow." "Yes," Sadie agreed, though sleep seemed an unlikely prospect with her heart beating so rapidly. They settled into their bedrolls, closer together than on previous nights due to the confined space of their shelter. Sadie lay awake for a long time, listening to Xavier's steady breathing and the soft rushing of the creek nearby. Her mind filled with possibilities that had seemed unthinkable just days before. Morning brought mist, and a light drizzle that persisted as they continued northward. The going was slower than anticipated, with mud making the steep trails treacherous. By midday, Xavier calculated they had covered only 7 miles, less than half their intended distance. "Need to push harder," he said, studying the gray sky with concern. "Weather's turning, if it gets worse." They pressed on through increasingly difficult conditions. The drizzle became a steady rain by afternoon, reducing visibility and turning every slope into a slippery challenge. Despite their best efforts, it became clear they would not reach their planned stopping point before nightfall. "There's an old trapper's cabin a few miles ahead," Xavier said as darkness began to close in. "Not much, but it would be dry." Sadie nodded gratefully, too cold and wet to speak. Her borrowed men's clothing had proven less water-resistant than hoped, and she was soaked to the skin. The cabin proved to be little more than a 3-sided shelter with a partially collapsed roof, but after hours in the open rain, it seemed like luxury. Xavier quickly cleared the space of debris while Sadie tended to the exhausted horses under the minimal protection of some overhanging pines. "We need a fire," Xavier decided, surveying Sadie's condition with concern. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge and she couldn't stop shivering. "Risk's worth it." Using skills honed by years in the wilderness, he managed to start a small fire despite the damp conditions, feeding it carefully until it produced welcome heat. Sadie huddled as close as safety permitted. gratefully accepting the blanket Xavier wrapped around her shoulders. "Need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll step outside while you change." "Into what?" Sadie asked through chattering teeth. "Everything's soaked." Xavier rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a relatively dry shirt. "Not much, but better than what you're wearing. I'll hang your things to dry." He turned his back politely while Sadie struggled out of her sodden clothing. The shirt he'd offered reached nearly to her knees, providing reasonable modesty. She wrapped the blanket around herself again before telling him he could turn around. If Xavier was affected by her state of undress, he showed no sign beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. He took her wet garments without comment and arranged them near the fire to dry. "Storm's settling in," he observed, looking out at the steadily falling rain. "Might have to wait it out before moving on." "Will we still reach Eagle's Rest in time?" Sadie asked, worried. "Cutting it close," Xavier admitted, "but we'll make it." He began removing his own wet coat and shirt, revealing a lean, muscular torso marked with several scars, testaments to a life that had seen its share of violence. Now it was Sadie's turn to avert her eyes, though not before a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her. They shared a meager supper of the last of their provisions, sitting close to maintain warmth. The rain drummed steadily on the partial roof above them, creating a strangely peaceful backdrop to their shelter. "Reminds me of when I was a boy," Xavier said unexpectedly, staring into the flames. "Used to camp with my grandfather in the Ozarks. He was a trapper, lived off the land his whole life. Never understood why his daughter married a banker." Sadie smiled at this glimpse into his past. "Is that where you learned all your wilderness skills?" Xavier nodded. "Summers with him were the only times I felt free, no expectations, no social niceties, just survival and simplicity." A shadow crossed his face. "After what happened with my father, I went back to those mountains for a while, tried to find that feeling again." "Did you?" Sadie asked softly. "Not entirely," he admitted. "Some things change you too much to ever go back completely." He looked up from the fire, his gaze meeting hers. "But I found enough peace to keep going, and eventually I found Montana." "And now," Sadie ventured, "have you found what you were looking for?" Xavier studied her for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his strong features. "Getting closer," he said finally, his voice low. The admission hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Sadie's breath caught in her throat as Xavier reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was tentative, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, she leaned into his palm, her eyes never leaving his. "Xavier," she whispered, his name both question and answer. He moved slowly, giving her time to reconsider, but Sadie had never been more certain of anything. When his lips finally met hers, the kiss was gentle at first, a careful exploration rather than a claiming. But as Sadie responded, her hand moving to his chest where she could feel his heart racing, the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more honest. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since I pulled you from that river," he admitted. "Even when I was half drowned and hysterical," Sadie teased, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Especially then," he replied with a rare smile. "You had fire in your eyes even when you were shivering." They talked long into the night, the storm forgotten as they shared histories and hopes, fears and dreams. Xavier spoke of his years with the Pinkertons, the cases that had shaped him and the disillusionment that had eventually driven him to seek solitude. Sadie told him of her mother's death when she was 16, her father's emotional retreat afterward, and her own quiet rebellion in educating herself beyond what was considered appropriate for a woman. As the fire burned low, they finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping close together for warmth, Xavier's arm protectively around Sadie's waist. For the first time in days, neither maintained a watch the storm, providing better protection than vigilance could have. Morning brought clearing skies and renewed determination. Their clothes had dried overnight, and though the trails would be muddy, travel was possible again. They departed at first light, pushing the horses as much as was safe on the treacherous ground. By midday, they had made excellent progress, covering more than half the remaining distance to Eagle's Rest. Xavier's mood lightened noticeably as they drew closer to their destination, though his vigilance never wavered. "If we maintain this pace, we'll reach the meeting place by tomorrow afternoon," he calculated as they paused to rest the horses. Plenty of time to prepare for Barnett's arrival. Sadie nodded, relief beginning to edge out the constant fear that had been her companion for days. "Do you think he'll bring marshals with him?" "Likely," Xavier confirmed. "Barnett understands the risks. He won't come alone." They continued northward through increasingly rugged terrain. The landscape had changed, subtly fewer pines, more dramatic rock formations, and occasional evidence of the mining operations that had once been common in the area. Abandoned equipment and the skeletal remains of sluice boxes appeared occasionally beside streams. Late in the afternoon, as they were negotiating a particularly steep section of trail, a gunshot suddenly cracked through the air. Xavier reacted instantly, almost yanking Sadie from her horse as he pulled her to cover behind a boulder. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his revolver. "Where did that come from?" "I don't know," Sadie whispered, heart pounding. "I didn't see anything." Xavier cautiously peered around the boulder. "Can't see a shooter, might have been a hunter, or a warning," Sadie suggested grimly. They waited in tense silence for several minutes, but no further shots came. Eventually, Xavier retrieved the horses, which had fortunately not bolted far, and they continued with redoubled caution. "Could have been nothing," Xavier said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "But we'll change course just in case. Take the high trail instead of following the valley." The detour added miles to their journey and forced them to make camp earlier than planned as darkness overtook them in unfamiliar territory. They ate the last of their food in silence, both aware of the risks that might lie ahead. "One more day," Xavier said as they prepared for sleep. "By this time tomorrow, this will all be over one way or another," Sadie nodded, leaning against him in the darkness. "Do you ever regret helping me? You could be safely at your cabin right now instead of being hunted." Xavier's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Not for a second," he said firmly. "Some choices you make with your head, some with your heart. Best ones are when both agree." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "This was both for me." They slept fitfully, taking turns at watch despite their exhaustion. Dawn found them already moving, pushing toward Eagle's Rest with determined urgency. By mid-morning, the landscape had changed dramatically, bare rocky slopes and deep ravines replacing the forested mountains they'd traveled through for days. Xavier pointed to a distant ridge where the remnants of wooden structures were just visible. "Eagle's Rest," he confirmed. Abandoned after the silver played out in '71, Barnett chose only one approach that can be easily monitored. They proceeded with extreme caution, Xavier constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of danger. As they drew closer to the ghost town, he directed them to a hidden ravine where they left the horses concealed among scrub pines. "We'll approach on foot from here," he decided, too exposed otherwise. The final mile was the most dangerous open ground with little cover between them and the abandoned mine buildings. Xavier led them on a circuitous route, using what little concealment existed to maximum advantage. They reached the outskirts of Eagle's Rest without incident, slipping into the remains of what had once been an assay office. The building's roof had partially collapsed, but its stone walls remained solid, offering protection from both elements and potential observers. "Barnett isn't due until tomorrow morning," Xavier said, checking his pocket watch. "We'll rest here and maintain a watch for anyone approaching." Sadie sank gratefully onto a fallen beam, muscles trembling with exhaustion and tension. "We made it," she breathed, hardly daring to believe they had reached their destination. "Not quite yet," Xavier cautioned, though he allowed himself a brief smile. "But we're close." They established a careful routine of alternating watch, one always observing the single trail leading to the abandoned settlement while the other rested. As dusk approached, Xavier's tension visibly increased. "What's wrong?" Sadie asked, noting his frequent checks of the surrounding area. "Too quiet," he replied. No birds, no small animals. Something's disturbed the natural order around here. Sadie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Do you think her question was answered before she could complete it? A voice called from outside the building, unnervingly familiar. Irons, I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk this through civilized-like. Xavier's expression hardened. Pullman, he murmured. Stay back, out of sight. Xavier, no, he silenced her with a look. Trust me, he whispered before calling back to the sheriff. Bit far from your jurisdiction, aren't you, Pullman? Just doing my job, came the reply. Got a fugitive to apprehend, nothing personal. Xavier moved to the doorway, positioning himself to see out while remaining partially protected by the stone wall. Looks personal from where I'm standing. Chasing a woman across 3 counties usually is. Sadie crept to a broken window on the building's side, needing to see what they were facing. What she saw made her blood run cold. Sheriff Pullman stood in the open area before the building, but he wasn't alone. At least 6 men were with him, all armed and positioned strategically around the clearing. Just want the woman and those papers she stole, Pullman called. You hand those over, you can ride away, no harm done. And if I don't, Xavier challenged. Pullman's laugh held no humor. Then things get messy. Got you outnumbered and outgunned, son. Don't throw your life away for some thieving female. Xavier's voice remained steady. Funny thing about that story, Sheriff, don't quite add up. Harvey kills himself when his scheme is discovered, then you pin it on his assistant. Convenient. You always were too clever for your own good, Irons, Pullman replied, his tone hardening. That's why you never fit in anywhere, always seeing problems nobody asked you to solve. Some problems need solving whether asked or not, Xavier countered. Sadie could see Pullman signaling to his men, directing them to spread out further. They were being surrounded. Fear constricted her throat, but it was quickly replaced by determination. She wouldn't let Xavier face this alone. Moving silently back to his side, she drew the revolver he'd taught her to use. 7 of them, she whispered. They're circling around. Xavier nodded, unsurprised. Barnett won't arrive until morning. We need to hold out until then. Last chance, Irons, Pullman called. Send out the woman and the papers. Xavier looked at Sadie, his blue eyes intense. Whatever happens, stay alive, he said quietly. Barnett will come, he'll believe you. Before she could respond, Xavier called back to the sheriff. No deal, Pullman. The lady stays with me and so do the papers. You want either, you'll have to come through me. The sheriff's response was immediate and violent, a volley of gunfire that forced them both to the floor as bullets splintered wood and ricocheted off stone. Back door, Xavier directed, pulling Sadie toward the rear of the building. When I start shooting, run for that storage shed across the way. I'll cover you. I won't leave you, Sadie protested. Not asking you to, Xavier replied grimly. Just need better position. They've got us pinned here. Another fusillade of bullets punctuated his words. Xavier waited for a brief pause, then rose and fired rapidly through the doorway and windows, creating enough confusion for Sadie to slip out the back. She ran low and fast, heart hammering as she sprinted for the indicated shed. A shot kicked up dirt near her feet, but she reached the shelter without injury. Seconds later, Xavier joined her, breathing hard. 2 down, he reported, but they're regrouping. The shed offered better protection than the assay office, smaller windows, thicker walls, and crucially, a view of the approach Barnett would take when he arrived. If they could hold this position until morning. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, bringing both advantage and difficulty. The decreased visibility made accurate shooting more challenging for their attackers, but also concealed their movements. They'll try to rush us under cover of darkness, Xavier predicted, checking his remaining ammunition with a frown. Running low on bullets, need to make every shot count. I still have a full cylinder, Sadie offered, her hand steady despite her fear. Xavier gave her a look of mingled pride and concern. Hope you won't need it. The night stretched endlessly, punctuated by occasional gunfire and taunts from Pullman and his men. They were playing a waiting game, hoping to exhaust or flush out their quarry. Xavier and Sadie took turns watching and resting, though true sleep was impossible under the circumstances. Near midnight, Sadie touched Xavier's arm. Movement to the west, she whispered. 2 men trying to circle behind us. Xavier nodded, impressed by her developing situational awareness. Good eyes, he murmured, moving to a position where he could observe without being seen. When the 2 deputies were within 30 yards, Xavier fired twice in rapid succession. 1 man cried out and fell, the other retreated hastily. 3 down, Xavier updated grimly. But that leaves 4, including Pullman. And we're almost out of ammunition, Sadie added, counting the remaining bullets. 6 shots between us. Xavier was silent for a long moment, clearly calculating options and finding them wanting. First light is about 4 hours away, he said finally. Barnett would likely start at dawn, putting him here by mid-morning. Too long to hold out, Sadie asked, reading his expression. With what we have, yes. Xavier's face was shadowed in the darkness, but his voice held a resolve that sent a chill through her. Sadie, I need you to do something. It won't be easy, she steeled herself. Anything? When I create a distraction, I need you to take the evidence and go. There's a narrow trail behind this building that leads up to the ridgeline. Follow it north until you reach the old mining road. Barnett will be coming that way, understanding dawned, cold, and terrible. You're creating a diversion. I'm buying time, Xavier corrected gently. Only way to ensure those papers reach Barnett. No, Sadie said, her voice surprisingly steady. I won't leave you to die. Not asking permission, Xavier replied, his tone softening as he reached out to touch her face. This was always the job, seeing justice done, whatever the cost. There has to be another way, Sadie insisted, gripping his wrist. We can make a stand together. Xavier shook his head. Would only end with both of us dead and those papers in Pullman's hands. Everything you've suffered would be for nothing. And what about us? Sadie demanded, tears finally breaking through her composure. Everything we've talked about a future together, was that just pretty words to keep me moving? No, Xavier said firmly, pulling her close. Every word was true, but some things matter more than what we want. He kissed her forehead. You matter more. Before Sadie could argue further, a new voice called from the darkness outside, not Pullman's, but equally confident. Sheriff Pullman, this is United States Marshal Fletcher. You and your men are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender peacefully. Xavier and Sadie exchanged shocked glances. Barnett, Xavier breathed, hope flickering in his eyes. He must have ridden through the night. Outside, confusion erupted among Pullman's men. Shouts and curses mingled with the sound of running feet. A shot rang out, followed by authoritative commands from multiple directions. Stay down, Xavier cautioned, moving to secure the door. Could be a trick. They waited in tense silence as the sounds of conflict continued outside. More shots, a cry of pain, then an eerie quiet broken only by occasional orders being shouted. Finally, a familiar voice called specifically to them. Xavier Irons, Miss O'Connor, this is Judge Barnett. You can come out now. It's over. Still cautious, Xavier approached the door. Show yourself, Judge, he called. Need to be sure. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s stepped into view, hands carefully visible. It's me, Xavier. Joseph Miller's message reached me in time, brought 4 marshals with me. Slowly, weapons still ready, Xavier opened the door. The scene outside confirmed the judge's words. Pullman and 2 of his remaining men were on their knees, hands bound behind them, while federal marshals stood guard. The bodies of the deputies Xavier had shot lay covered with blankets. Judge Barnett, Xavier acknowledged, finally lowering his gun. Your timing is impeccable. Hardly, the judge replied dryly. Arrived to find a small war in progress. Fortunate we came when we did. Sadie stepped forward, still clutching the precious satchel. Your Honor, I have evidence of corruption and murder involving Sheriff Pullman and others in Coloma. Barnett nodded gravely. So Mr. Miller's message indicated, we'll review it thoroughly once we're somewhere more civilized. He glanced at the captive sheriff. Though I must say, finding him so far outside his jurisdiction in pursuit of a single fugitive already raised significant questions about his motives. Pullman glared hatefully at Sadie. She's lying, he spat. Killed Harvey and stole from the bank. Whatever papers she has are forgeries. Save it for your trial, Pullman, one of the marshals advised, jerking him to his feet. Judge don't much care for your version right now. As dawn broke fully over the abandoned mining camp, reality began to sink in. It was over. They had survived, the evidence was safe, and justice was finally in motion. Sadie felt lightheaded with relief, exhaustion, and residual fear. Xavier must have noticed her unsteadiness because his arm came around her waist, supporting her. "Easy," he murmured. "It's done." Judge Barnett observed them with shrewd eyes. "You both look dead on your feet. There's a ranger station a few hours' ride from here. We can rest there while I review Miss O'Connor's evidence." The journey to the ranger station passed in a blur for Sadie. The marshals had brought extra horses, allowing her and Xavier to ride separately, but he stayed close beside her the entire way, as if still protecting her despite the danger having passed. The station provided basic but welcome comforts: clean water, hot food, and actual beds. While the marshals secured Pullman and his surviving men in a makeshift holding cell, Judge Barnett settled at her rough table to examine the ledgers and documents Sadie had risked her life to preserve. Xavier joined her outside on the station's porch as the afternoon waned, bringing her a cup of strong coffee. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Still expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream," Sadie admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "It doesn't seem real that it's actually over." "Not completely over," Xavier cautioned. "There'll be trials, testimonies, might get ugly before it's finished." Sadie nodded, having already considered this. "I know, but at least now there's a chance for justice. For Jamie Sullivan and all the others Pullman and Harvey wronged." Xavier studied her profile in the fading light, admiration clear in his expression. "You're something special, Sadie O'Connor. Most people would be thinking about their own vindication right now." "You're thinking about strangers you never met." "Not so special," Sadie demurred. "Just trying to do what's right, same as you." The door opened behind them and Judge Barnett emerged, his expression grave but satisfied. "Miss O'Connor, Mr. Irons. I've reviewed the evidence, and I must say it's the most comprehensive documentation of corruption I've seen in 20 years on the bench." Sadie straightened, hope rising. "Then you believe me." "The evidence speaks for itself," Barnett confirmed. "I've already written orders for the arrest of the remaining conspirators in Coloma, and I'll be personally overseeing the case against Sheriff Pullman." He hesitated, then added more gently, "I should warn you both, this won't be simple. These men have influence and they'll fight desperately to discredit you." "We expected as much," Xavier replied, his shoulder brushing Sadie's in silent support. "There's more," Barnett continued. "Given the seriousness of these crimes and the high-ranking officials involved, the territorial governor has taken an interest. He's requesting that Miss O'Connor travel to Helena immediately to provide a formal deposition." Sadie nodded, unsurprised by the request. "Of course, Your Honor. Whatever is needed for justice to be served." "Good," Barnett approved. "We'll depart for Helena tomorrow. Marshal Fletcher and his men will escort us, ensuring no further incidents." His gaze shifted to Xavier. "I assume you'll be accompanying Miss O'Connor." "Yes, sir," Xavier replied without hesitation. "If she'll have me." Sadie's hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. "I will." Later, after a simple but satisfying meal, Sadie and Xavier found themselves alone again on the porch. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the Montana sky, and for the first time in days they could breathe without fear. "What happens now?" Sadie asked, leaning against the porch railing beside him. "After Helena, I mean." Xavier was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "That depends," he said finally. "On what?" He turned to face her fully, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "On what you want, Sadie, on what we both want." "I want," Sadie began, then smiled. "I want to never have to run for my life again, for starters." Xavier's lips quirked in response. "Reasonable request. I want to see Pullman and his associates face justice for what they've done," she continued more seriously. "I want to help make things right for the people they wronged. And after that," Xavier prompted softly. Sadie met his gaze steadily. "After that, I want a life that matters, work that uses my skills for good, and," she took a deep breath, "I want you, Xavier, whatever that means, wherever that leads us." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned as Xavier himself. His response was equally direct. He drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words might have failed to express. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as if committing the moment to memory. "Cabin's too small for two," he murmured. "Would need expanding." Sadie laughed softly, joy bubbling through her despite the exhaustion and lingering fear. "Are you asking me to help you build an addition, Mr. Irons?" "Asking for more than that," Xavier replied, drawing back slightly to meet her eyes. "Asking if you'd consider making it your home, making a life together." His expression grew serious. "Won't be easy. Land's demanding, winters are harsh, and I'm not always good company." "I've seen you at your worst already," Sadie pointed out, reaching up to touch his face. "Running for our lives, sleep-deprived and outgunned, still want you." A rare, full smile transformed Xavier's features. "That a yes, Miss O'Connor?" "It's a yes," Sadie confirmed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him again. "Though we should probably wait until after the trials to make any official announcements." "Agreed," Xavier said, his arms tightening around her waist. "Besides, gives us time to plan properly, do things right." As they stood together under the vast Montana sky, Sadie marveled at how unexpectedly life had turned. She had lost everything: her reputation, her security, nearly her life, yet somehow gained something infinitely more precious in the process. "They don't believe me," she had said in despair beside a rushing river, her world collapsing around her. "Then I'll speak loud enough for both of us," Xavier had replied, standing between her and danger without hesitation. And he had with his actions, his unwavering support, and finally with his heart. Together they had fought for truth when it would have been easier to surrender, and together they would build whatever came next. The path to Helena and beyond would not be easy. There would be trials and testimonies, public scrutiny and private challenges. But as Sadie rested in Xavier's embrace, watching stars wheel above the mountains that would become their home, she knew with absolute certainty that they would face it all as they had faced Pullman side by side, stronger together than either could be alone. Over the following months, Sadie's prediction about the difficulty of the trials proved accurate. The proceedings in Helena became the sensation of the territory, with newspapers from as far away as Denver covering the story of corruption in Coloma and the brave bookkeeper who exposed it. Pullman and his surviving conspirators fought viciously, attempting to discredit Sadie with vicious rumors and character assassination. But the evidence she had preserved spoke louder than their desperate lies, and Judge Barnett maintained strict control of his courtroom, preventing the worst of their tactics. Xavier remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a constant reminder that she was no longer facing the world alone. When it was his turn to testify about the pursuit and the confrontation at Eagle's Rest, his clear, factual account impressed even the defense attorneys, who quickly abandoned attempts to rattle him on cross-examination. 6 months after their arrival in Eagle's Rest, the verdicts were delivered. Sheriff Pullman and Councilman Davis, who had been arrested in Coloma following the judge's orders, were convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement, corruption, falsifying evidence, and in Pullman's case, murder. Both received lengthy prison sentences, effectively ending their reign of influence in Madison County. More importantly to Sadie, the convictions of Jamie Sullivan and the other minors who had been falsely accused were overturned, with full pardons issued by the territorial governor himself. Restitution was ordered from the seized assets of the conspirators, providing some measure of compensation for their suffering. When the trials finally concluded, Sadie and Xavier fulfilled their promise to each other. They were married in a simple ceremony in Helena, with Judge Barnett himself officiating and Joseph Miller serving as witness. The judge, who had grown fond of the couple during the long legal proceedings, presented them with a wedding gift official documentation transferring an additional 80 acres of land adjacent to Xavier's existing property, granted in recognition of Sadie's service to justice in the territory. Territory needs more citizens like you too, Barnett told them at the small reception following the ceremony. Folks willing to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. They returned to Xavier's cabin. Now their cabin as spring was transforming the Montana landscape. True to his word, Xavier began work immediately on expanding their home, with Sadie proving herself as capable with a hammer and saw as she had been with ledgers and accounts. By summer's end, the cabin had doubled in size with a proper bedroom, an expanded kitchen, and most precious to Sadie, a small study with built-in bookshelves where she could work and read. Xavier had crafted the desk himself from pine harvested on their land, presenting it to her with characteristic understated pride. "For your new venture," he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth surface. The venture was Sadie's response to an unexpected development following the trials. Several local businesses, impressed by her attention to detail and financial acumen, had approached her about reviewing their books and establishing proper accounting systems. What began as occasional consultations quickly evolved into a legitimate business, with Sadie riding circuit between ranches and businesses much as a judge might between courtrooms. Xavier supported her work completely, often accompanying her on longer journeys and expanding his own small cattle operation in the meantime. They developed a partnership in the truest sense, each contributing their strengths while respecting the other's independence. Their life wasn't without challenges. The harsh Montana winters tested them severely, especially the first year when blizzards isolated them for weeks. There were difficult neighbors who resented a woman in business, and occasional visitors from Coloma who had believed Pullman's version of events and viewed Sadie with suspicion. But there were far more joys than sorrows. The satisfaction of building something together, the respect they earned from those who mattered, and the deep, abiding love that had been forged in crisis and flourished in peace. 2 years after their marriage, their family expanded with the birth of their son, whom they named James partly after Jamie Sullivan, whose wrongful imprisonment had spurred Sadie to action, and partly after Xavier's grandfather, who had taught him to value independence and integrity above all. As Sadie nursed their son by the fire one winter evening, Xavier watched them with undisguised wonder. "Never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "After what happened with my father, figured I was better off alone. And now?" Sadie asked, smiling up at him. "Now I know better," Xavier replied, joining them beside the fire and gently touching his son's dark hair. "Some things are worth the risk." 5 years after the events at Eagle's Rest, Judge Barnett visited their expanded homestead while on circuit through the region. He marveled at the transformation not just of the property, which now boasted a larger house, proper barns, and a small herd of quality cattle, but of the couple themselves. Xavier had shed much of his former intensity, though none of his principles, while Sadie had developed a quiet confidence that extended far beyond her considerable professional success. "You've built something remarkable here," the judge observed as they showed him around. And not just these buildings. Later, as they sat on the wide porch Xavier had added the previous summer, Barnett shared news from around the territory. Coloma had changed significantly, the corrupt power structure dismantled, new leadership established. Sadie's father had finally acknowledged his error in judgment and had been writing letters seeking reconciliation. "Will you see him if he comes?" the judge asked gently. Sadie exchanged a glance with Xavier before nodding. "Yes, the past is past, we've all made mistakes." As dusk settled over the mountains, their 4-year-old son played nearby with the puppy Xavier had brought home that spring, his laughter carrying clearly in the evening air. Sadie's hand rested unconsciously on her middle, where their second child was just beginning to make its presence known. "You know," Barnett said thoughtfully, "what happened in Coloma was terrible, but sometimes I wonder." "Wonder what?" Xavier prompted. "If things had gone differently, if Sadie had never discovered those ledgers, or if you hadn't been by that river that day, none of this would exist." He gestured to encompass the homestead, the family, the life they had created. Sometimes justice works in mysterious ways. Later that night, with James asleep and the judge settled in their guest room, Sadie and Xavier stood together on the porch, watching stars appear above the land that had become their sanctuary and their future. "You ever regret it?" Sadie asked softly. "Getting involved in my troubles that day?" Xavier's arm tightened around her waist, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers where it lay against their unborn child. "Not for a single moment," he said, his voice as steady and true as it had been when he first promised to speak for her when no one else would believe. "Neither do I," Sadie whispered, leaning into his strength. Not one moment. Above them, the Montana sky stretched endless and bright with possibility, while around them, the home they had built together stood as testament to the power of truth, courage, and love that refuses to be silenced.